Hello friends, welcome back to my studio. I hope you're well. We've been having some very wild weather this week and I think that means summer is finished and autumn is here, which is lovely. I absolutely love autumn. So as the title says, today's video is about oil paint versus acrylic paint. And there's the chooks laying an egg. Yes, oil paint versus acrylic paint. Oil paint, of course, is oil-based and acrylic paint is water-based, but there is a lot more difference to them than those things. This here is a recent piece I've started to rework, is in oils, and the camera might be picking up the shine and the vitality of that. And this one here in the background is an acrylic painting I did a while back, and I will bring that closer when we get to it to show you the differences on the surface of the canvas between the paint. But right now let's turn the camera around and we'll get some paint out and we'll talk through the differences. I hope you find it really helpful. I've got some of the same colours in acrylic and I've decided to show you in the golden because these are the most pigmented acrylic paints I know of. And I've got some oil paint in the exact same colour so we can really see side by side. And I'll also mix them with the corresponding titanium white to help show them up on the camera better. So it's mostly the same pigments across both the acrylic and the oil paint. It's what the pigment is suspended in is what changes. And you can see there the oil paint really holds the shape of coming out of the tube. Oil paint is very, very thick because it's pigment mixed with linseed oil generally, which is from flax plant. And acrylic paint is suspended in a binder called synthetic polymer. So it's water-based and this is oil-based. Golden is a heavy body paint, but you can see it's much softer than the oil. And if we just mix some of this oil out, you can see the density of the pigment here in the oil. Now these are the same colours. They're both a quin magenta. But you can see already how much more pigment here is in the oil, and that's because the synthetic polymer, the base in acrylic paint, can only hold 3/4 of the pigment of the linseed oil in oil paint. So it's much denser and richer in colour. And this is a really highly pigmented acrylic paint. And look at this oil, it still has heaps more pigment in it. And you might also, the camera might also be picking up the oily, glossy, shiny nature of this paint compared to this more matte and a little bit plasticky looking paint and that's the binder. Now because you can get much more pigment load in the oil paint will cost much more for the same size tube than an acrylic paint. And that holds true also for cheaper brands of acrylic paint. They'll be cheaper because they'll have less pigment in them, because it's the pigment that is where the cost lies. The next big difference between acrylic and oil is the drying time. The acrylic paint is water-based and it dries by evaporation, and that can happen particularly if you're in a warmer environment. That can happen very, very quickly. The oil paint doesn't dry, it actually cures. It needs to oxidize. So the oil in the paint absorbs oxygen and cures. So because it doesn't actually dry but cures, that's why it takes a long time to dry, which can be fantastic if you want to continue to work in your painting. You can have something that it stays wet for days and you can continue to work in with that, and that works really well if you like to blend. It helps you blend colours, whereas this fast drying time of the acrylic doesn't allow for that blending, but if you like to work quickly, then this acrylic paint will work really, really well for you. If you like to work quick and you're using oils and you're working wet on wet, which is actually a technique called alla prima, the fallback of that can be that you will mix the colours so much that you'll just get muddy, messy colours, lots of browns. So it can be a much slower process waiting for layers to dry in using oils. And if you like to work quickly, then the acrylic is a great way to go. The surface preparation also is a little bit different. The oil paint will need, let's get some more colour going. The oil paint will need a protection over the canvas or a specific oil paper to be used, because the oil in the paint will actually eat away at the canvas. So you need a gesso base on the canvas. It does two things. It helps protect the canvas because the oil will rot the canvas. Whereas your acrylic paint, there's a lot of oil separated from the pigment there, but we can bind that back in. The acrylic paint, which is what gesso is as acrylic, can just go straight onto a canvas and be fine. It'll act like a gesso layer. It can be good to put gesso on still because it gives you a bit of a surface that's already built up, and you'll be able to use less paint in the acrylic, but an oil definitely needs that protection put under it of the gesso. So there's quite a lot of difference. They again are both the same colour. They're both a cobalt teal, and there's a lot of difference because of that pigment load that the oil paint has. The acrylic paint can also have the drying time sped up by using a heat gun or a hairdryer over the acrylic paint. The oil paint, you can add in a liquid or galcid. So any alkyd type of product can help speed up the oil drying process, but nowhere near still what the acrylic will dry as. This is a liquid light gel. You can also get just liquid, and you add that into your oil paint, and it just helps speed up oxidization and helps it cure quickly, but it's still going to be very, very slow drying. And then for your acrylic paint, you can slow the drying with mediums like this. This is a drying retarder, and this will help slow down the evaporation and the drying time of the acrylic, and will help extend your time, so bringing it closer to like it is working with oils. I've used this a lot, and it's a great product, particularly when the studio gets very hot and these acrylics are just drying before I can get them onto the painting surface. A little bit of this medium in really helps slow that down. There's also the archival quality of the two. Of course, oil paint has been used for centuries, and we still have paintings that were painted that long ago. So you'll get a really, really long archival quality with oil paint. Therefore, paintings can be used as an investment because of that longevity that they have. So you can expect, stored properly, painted properly, an oil painting will last 400 to 500 years. Acrylic has come a long, long way, and you can now get up to 300 to 400 years from an acrylic painting. Oil paint was certainly seen as gallery quality, archival quality, true art, and acrylic really wasn't seen in the same light, but there are certainly many very successful artists, gallery represented artists, that are working exclusively in acrylic. So that archival thing, the gap has really reduced in that these days. So you can see this really glossy nature of the oil paint compared to this more plasticky matte of the acrylic. Now, if you like matte, great, acrylic's for you. You're not going to really be able to get an oil paint to look matte, no matter what medium you add to it. So if matte's your preference, acrylic's for you. The matte nature of the acrylic paint can make it look a little bit flatter, a little bit lifeless, and particularly if you add a lot of the titanium white in, it can look a bit chalky to finish. You see how much pigment it's in that, how much more white I'm needing to add to that to get to this pinky colour. I will show you a painting in a moment. Oil paintings will remain glossy through the life of the painting, and even an acrylic painting with varnish over it still won't have the gloss and the sheen that the oil paint will have. So it's really, again, a personal preference of whether you really like that glossy depth or whether you like a more matte finish. So as you can see, the oils are very, very thick coming out of the tube, and you really need to work with a medium with the oils. So that can add to the cost of needing some solvents like this solvent 75 that I use, an odor-free solvent, and also some oil. You can use linseed oil, walnut oil, safflower oil. So you really need to have a thinner and an oil when you're working with the oil paints. Whereas with the acrylic, you could use, as you can see, they're much softer. Even a heavy body paint is much softer. Or you can just add water. Of course, there's so many mediums you can buy to go with your acrylic paint, but you can just use it pretty much straight out of the tube. And so because the oil paint needs these extra things, the paintings themselves will also be priced more expensive than an acrylic painting. So that's a difference there. Just because your paint or your materials are more expensive, your paint, your thinners and your oil that go in it compared to pretty much ready out of the tube to go. So these can be a great beginner point, and that's where I think this division of beginner and professional come into play, but really you can be professional and only work in acrylics. The other thing that you need to consider with oil is the fat over lean rule. There's a few more rules that go with using oil paint, and the fat over lean means because of the slow drying, if you've got a really nice thick layer of your oil paint and then you paint a thin glaze over the top of that, the glaze, because it's thin, will dry or cure more quickly than this really thick layer, and you'll find that that thin layer will crack over the top. Now that could be a really nice effect, but archivally, how are you going to keep that glaze on the surface if it's all cracked? It'll generally want to fall off. So you need to work fat over lean, which means each layer as you build on the canvas has less solvent and more oil in it. So the oil is a fat. So as you're painting, your underlayers might be lots of glazes, and you could paint a whole painting just in glazes. But if you have a heavy oil layer, so it's not about how much oil paint's in there, it's about how much oil you've added. It gives you your fat. So as soon as you have a fat layer on there, you're then restricted from using any thin layers. So you need to work fat over lean. Acrylic paint, you can go for it because it dries so quickly. You can have a really thick, dense layer. It will pretty much be dry, ready to go, a nice thin wash over the top. The other rule is you can't mix these two because one's water and one's oil and they will resist each other. You can paint oil over the top of acrylic because, as I said earlier, acrylic is very much like a gesso. So you can paint, and it's a lovely way to introduce oil paint into your practice if you're not already using it, is paint your painting first with your acrylic colours, and then once you get to a certain point, you can shift into using oil paint. And it means you'll use less of the oil paint because you've already got lots of layers and colour in there. And you'll get that glossy nature and all those benefits you get from using oil paint. The last thing I'd like to talk to you about the difference between the acrylic and oil is the toxicity of the paint. And it's a little bit of a misconception that the oil paint is toxic because two reasons. Toxicity in the pigment comes from things like heavy metals, like the cadmium range. You can get cadmium in reds, orange, blues and yellows. And now, luckily, all of our labels are marked with poison. And I hope that is law around the world. But certainly in Australia, they have started to label paint. Now, this is an acrylic paint, and you can see it's marked poison. So that is as toxic as the oil version of that paint, and it's because of the heavy metals in the pigment. So a pigment in the oil range that isn't a heavy metal is quite safe. The linseed oil is flax, it's plant-based, it's quite safe. The toxicity comes in the solvents, in the thinners, and a lot of the time artists use terps, and of course that is very toxic. It's the fumes as well as getting it on your skin. So it's a very good idea to wear gloves when you're using any paint, particularly if you're using one of the cadmium colours. It's a really good idea to wear gloves so you're not getting it on your skin. And the other thing is the odour. And so that's why I'm using this Solvent 75. It's a low toxicity. See here it says the lowest toxicity of solvent available. It's odourless, which means that odour that you can get from terps can really upset people and give them headaches and make them feel quite ill, and of course extended over time that can make you quite sick. So these are great. The problem is they're still a thinner, and because they're odourless you can't smell how much of it is hanging in the air, and you still may get a headache from this, but you can't smell why you're getting a headache. So you still need to, if you're using thinners with your oil paint, you need to work in a well-ventilated area and have gloves on. And just watch for those products that say non-toxic. They're just odourless, they're not non-toxic. And hopefully, because there's no odour, you won't have a reaction to them. But just to be mindful that there's still molecules in the air of these things. So now let's look at a couple of examples on the canvas. Just before we do, I'll just mention that it's a good idea to keep your solvents in a closed jar and only have a small amount out on the surface will also help stop that becoming a problem in your studio. So here's an example of the oil painting, and not sure if that's picking it up, but it almost still looks wet. And that's been drying now for about a week and a half, and there's a couple of places it's wet, but it's pretty much, particularly this background, is dry to touch, but it doesn't necessarily look that way. And I've got a painting here I did back in 2016. This is an old landscape of mine. So this is about 6 years, getting on to 6 years old, painted in oils. And I'm hoping the camera will be picking up just that luminosity that the oil paint has, and the way I've been able to really blend. I haven't mixed the colours on the palette for this, I've mixed them on the canvas and really blended all of this sky in. And this has no varnish over the top of it, and it's still got all of that shine and luminosity. So they're the beautiful thing that an oil paint can do for you. And then this painting here, which I did this year, it has got a traditional varnish over the top. It's acrylic, and the light of course is picking up a little bit of that shine. So while it's shiny because of the varnish, it's, do you see what I mean about the color is a bit more flat? And that's fantastic if that's what you want to achieve, and that you're aware of that. That, can you see that the paint is just, even though the strokes are very lively, it's just a little bit more flat on the surface. I've got the shine and the gloss, but it's just that little bit more flat. Acrylic paint versus oil paint in a nutshell. They are the same pigments generally. It's what the pigment is suspended in that makes them different. The oil paint, of course, is oil, and your acrylic paint is water-based, suspended in a synthetic polymer. The cost is different because the load of pigment in your oil paint is much higher. So your oil paint will be tube for tube. Your oil paint is dearer. Drying time. Oil paint, because it needs to cure, takes a lot longer to dry than the acrylic paint, which can have its benefits and hindrance depending on how you like to work. Blending is easier with your oil paint because of that soft, oily nature to them. If you're wanting to blend in acrylics, you need to have a spray bottle wetting the surface or masking off areas to get a straight edge. Much easier straight edge with that, whereas your oil paint, you can get nice hard edges very, very easily. The archival quality of the two, acrylic paint has come a long, long way, and acrylic painting will last 300 to 400 years, and an oil painting 400 to 500 years. Acrylic paint, oil paint, matte, gloss. And oil paint needs mediums to work with, and acrylic paint straight out of the tube or with a little bit of water, mediums if you like. The technical rules with oil paint can be a little bit to get your head around, but once you're well versed in them, there's no problem at all. But there are rules of the fat over lean and proper preparation of your painting surface. And lastly, I spoke about the toxicity and the being careful to read your labels, that acrylic paint in some instances is as toxic as oil paint, and the toxicity really comes in the thinners and the solvents like terps that you're using with the paint. So I hope that's helped explain the difference between the two mediums and why you would choose one over the other. There perhaps is still a bit of a stigma about you're not a real artist if you're not using oils, and that's certainly just not true anymore. If you're buying really good quality acrylic paint, like I use predominantly the Matisse brand or Golden, or the higher end Liquitex paints, acrylic paints will hold their colors well and behave very well in a painting. You don't have to use oils, but with oils you can see you get a richness. There's just so much more pigment in them, so you get a richness, and that richness stays after the painting's cured, and for years and years and years you still have that luminosity that you don't have with the acrylic, but perhaps you want a flatter, more matte look. So if you've been wanting to use oil paint and haven't, I hope that explains why and how, and that you'll give it a go. And if you've always painted in acrylics and love them, go for it. What you always hear me say is living a creative life is a blessed life, and it really doesn't matter what you're using as long as you're creating. Have a lovely week. Go well. See you next week. Bye.